Good morning everyone. I am Dr. Sahabuddin Ahamed, Assistant Professor in the Department of English at Pandit Sundarlal Sharma Open University, Chhattisgarh, India. Welcome you all to this virtual lecture. In this lecture, I will discuss the topic major symbols in Joseph Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness. In this lecture, I will explain how symbols contribute to the novel's critique of imperialism and human nature. To begin with, Heart of Darkness is a symbolic novel. In this novel, Joseph Conrad conveys complex ideas through novels. To begin with, Heart of Darkness is a symbolic novel. In this novel, Joseph Conrad conveys complex ideas through symbols. In other words, rather than stating ideas directly, Joseph Conrad presents ideas through symbols. Conrad himself believed that meaning lies beneath the surface. That means he conveys meaning indirectly through the symbols, and this is evident when the character Marlowe says the meaning of an episode was not inside like a kernel but outside. As a result, readers are encouraged to think critically. Readers are encouraged to interpret meanings rather than accept simple conclusions. So, Conrad uses symbolism to critique imperialism, civilization and the human psyche. Symbolism invites a deeper interpretation rather than literal reading, literal meaning of the novella Heart of Darkness. Now, in this slide, why symbolism matters. Symbolism functions as a modernist narrative strategy. Objects, spaces and journeys are seen as carriers of meaning. Symbol contain multiple meanings, interpretations. Conrad's symbols are not fixed, but they remain ambiguous. Symbols encourage readers to interpret the novella. It encourages multiple readings rather than moral certainty or surface meaning. Next, firstly, I would like to talk about the symbol, the river Congo. The river Congo is one of the most important symbol in the novella. It represents journey into the African interior. So, it not only represents a journey into Africa, but of the human mind. In the novella, Marlowe travels deeper the Congo river. He moves away from civilization, certainty, and he moves toward moral ambiguity, moral uncertainty. So, that is why the river is very symbolic. The river is described in the novel as an immense snake uncoiled. So, this river is compared to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. It suggests that danger and temptation. It also suggests the fall of man that happened in the Garden of Eden in paradise. So, that is why the river is comparable to the serpent. The river functions like a serpentine path. It draws Marlowe inward, suggesting Marlowe's movement away from certainty water towards the darker regions of the human mind, human psyche. Hence, the river symbolizes moral and psychological descent. So, it is Marlowe's descent into the lost world. Now, moving ahead, the knitters. In the novella, the two knitters knitting black wool when Marlowe visits his aunt. The two knitters knitting black wool, they symbolize the fates. According to the fates of Greek mythology, fates determine the moment of birth, events of life and death. Next slide, darkness. Darkness is one of the most dominant symbol in the novel. In the novel, darkness represents moral corruption and inner evil. Importantly, Conrad does not associate darkness with Africa itself. Instead, Conrad uses darkness to expose the inner darkness of Europeans who were involved in colonial exploitation, subjugation of native Africans. So, that is why it is not the darkness of Africa, it is the inner darkness of Europeans. Marlowe refers to colonial Europe as one of the dark places of the earth. It indicates that darkness exists within civilized societies. Therefore, darkness exposes the brutal nature of civilized Europeans, especially when they claiming moral superiority, civilization. Next, light. In contrast to darkness, light traditionally symbolizes knowledge and progress. However, Joseph Conrad uses light ironically. Civilization, the so-called civilizing mission of Europe, hides exploitation and violence. That is to say, the civilizing mission of imperialism hides exploitation, violence, cruelty. So, that is why ironical. So, this is irony that is clear because imperialism is presented as a philanthropic pretense. Conrad exposes its hypocrisy because imperialism is associated with exploitation, brutality and violence. Thus, the light becomes a symbol of false moral superiority, false ideals, false civilizational ideals. Next, Mr. Cooge. Mr. Cooge, the central character, the European colonizers, he functions as a central human symbol. Mr. Cooge represents what happens when power is exercised without restraint. Previously, in the novel, we see how Mr. Cooge was an emissary of European civilization, progress, science, technology, Christianity, but later he descends into madness, moral emptiness, because he exercises power that is absolute power, that is without moral restraint. Mr. Cooge is described as a remarkable man as he gathers and sends much ivory to Europe by using his methods of brutality and loots, genocide. That is why his actions reveal moral corruption, moral emptiness. Consequently, Mr. Cooge symbolizes the collapse of European ideals under imperial power, imperial dominance. Mr. Cook's final words in the novel, the horror, summarize the moral vision of the novel. His words suggest a moment of self-awareness and self-judgment. At this point, Mr. Cook recognizes the violence and cruelty, his own actions and imperialism. So, it is the recognition of violence and cruelty done by Mr. Cook himself and the European empire itself. Therefore, his final words encapsulate the novel's philosophical core, an awakening that comes too late when Mr. Cook dies. Next, the slide on focusing on the wilderness. The African wilderness in the novella is not evil but indifferent. The wilderness exposing the fragility of European ethical judgment, ethical structures. Actually, the wilderness is not evil, it is associated with the moral corruption of Europeans. The symbol of ivory. Ivory, important symbol in the novel. Ivory symbolizes greed and economic exploitation. So, ivory is the real motive behind European colonization of the Congo Free State in Africa, and the reference to ivory reveals the profit, exploitation, mass execution. So, it is not civilization, it is ivory that drives European imperialism. So, as a result, human life becomes secondary to material gain. Ivory becomes a fetishist object to Europeans. Because of ivory, how European colonizers reduce Africans and Europeans to the instrument of profit, alienation, isolation, madness, moral emptiness. Next, the intended. Mr. Cook's intended symbolizes illusion and denial. The intended believes in Mr. Cook's nobility and moral greatness. Marlowe observes that the intended lives in a world of her own illusion. She is separated from reality. That's why she represents the comforting lies that sustain imperial ideology. In the final moment of the novel, we see how Marlowe lies to the intended, exposing the ideological lies of empire itself. The symbol fog reflects Marlowe's inability to clearly judge events. It reinforces the novel's epistemological uncertainty, ambiguity. Next, the slide focusing on drums and sounds. Drums and sounds operate symbolically in this novel. It destabilizes European rationality. It challenges linguistic authority, because Europeans begin to think of drums and sounds as something evil or something unknown. Now, the symbol journey, like the journeys of Odysseus, Aeneas and Dante, Marlowe's journey into the African wilderness symbolizes his descent into the underworld, comparable to a lost Eden where Charlie Marlowe meets Mr. Cook. So, this journey is a journey of self-discovery, because Charlie Marlowe realizes the consequences of European imperialism in Africa. So that's why, unlike traditional quest for knowledge, Marlowe's journey leads not to enlightenment but to disillusionment. He comes to realize the moral failure of imperial ideals. Now moving to critical voices. Critical voices, Edward Said and Chinua Achebe. At this point, it is important to consider critical responses to Heart of Darkness. African novelist and critic Chinua Achebe strongly condemns Joseph Conrad's portrayal of Africa. According to him, the novel presents Africa and Africans as a place without history, humanity, culturally other, savage, brute. Achebe famously described Joseph Conrad as a thoroughgoing racist because of his such derogatory, inhuman representation of Africa and Africans. He argues that even though the novel criticizes imperialism, it dehumanizes Africans by denying their voice agency. That is to say, no African character is given voice agency. Most of African characters remain silent in the novel. However, another postcolonial critic, Edward Said, offers a more balanced view. He acknowledges Conrad's critique of imperialism, but he points out Conrad's limitation. Said argues that Conrad saw and condemned the evil of imperialism, yet he could not imagine a world beyond European assumption. Therefore, Conrad exposes imperial brutality, but Conrad remains trapped within a European perspective, Eurocentric perspective. So we can say that Conrad's representation of Africa exposes imperial brutality, cruelty. On the other hand, his representation trapped within Eurocentric perspective, because he has not given any voice to African characters. To conclude, it is clear that symbolism in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness allows Conrad to criticize imperialism indirectly but powerfully. Through multiple symbols such as river, darkness, Mr. Coos, ivory, the journey, the novel exposes the moral emptiness behind the idea of European civilization. Conrad compels readers to confront uncomfortable truths about empire and human nature. However, critics like Chinua Achebe and Edward Said suggest the novel's critique is limited by racial and cultural assumptions. Therefore, the novel must be read critically, the novel recognizing both its insight and its silence. Now, I hope this presentation has provided useful insight. I welcome any questions, comments from you. I am happy to answer any questions. That's all for today's session. We will meet again soon with another video. Thank you for watching and listening.